welcome to the latest episode of Suits and Boots, the TDI podcast series. I'm Sarah Wilkinson, Marketing Manager at TDI Sustainability, and in this episode we'll be talking about free, prior and informed consent, or FPIC. The global push for clean energy is essential for mitigating climate change. However, the rapid expansion of renewable energy projects and the increased demand for critical minerals to fuel them are increasingly impacting Indigenous lands, cultures and resources. This podcast will explore the intersection of Indigenous rights, the right to free, prior and informed consent, and the evolving landscape of the just energy transition. We'll be looking at how companies can and have engaged in the FPIC process responsibly. I'm delighted to be joined today for this discussion by Daniel Cardenas, who sits on Equitable Origin's Board of Directors. Equitable Origin is an independent, non-profit organisation that partners with businesses, communities and government to support responsible energy development, prompting social and environmental best practices, transparency and accountability. Daniel currently serves as the CEO, President and Chairman of the Board of the American Indian Infrastructure Association and the National Tribal Energy Association, which are both trade associations that represent the interests of Native American tribes across the United States. He's a member of the Hamawi Band of the Pitt River Tribe of California and was an elected member of the Tribal Council of the Pitt River Tribe, a federally recognized tribe representing the Hamawi Band for over 15 years. He makes his home at St. Stephen's, Wyoming, on the Wind River Indian Reservation with his children, who are members of the Northern Arapaho tribe. Daniel's previous experiences include developing infrastructure-related public-private partnerships in the West United States, including rail, bridge, and road projects. He's the owner of Seven Generations Infrastructure, a tribal renewable energy infrastructure development firm. Daniel has also served on various non-profit boards, sits on the advisory committee of the Climate Equity in the Clean Air Transition Project, which is sponsored by the Clean Air Task Force, and he also co-founded the Wind River Community Foundation and Knowledge River, an Indigenous energy STEM initiative. Joining Daniel and leading today's discussion is Kaki Comer, Standards Development Manager at Equitable Origin. Kaki has extensive experience in advancing responsible business practices across the energy, mining and international development sectors in the US and Latin America. As Standards Development Manager at Equitable Origin, she's led the refinement and rollout of the FPIC 360 tool, designed to assess and strengthen enabling conditions for FPIC through multi-party engagement. So welcome, Kaki and Daniel. I'll hand over to you now for today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction. I just wanted to start off with a quick explanation of FPIC for any listeners who are new to the concept, and then we can jump into the discussion. FPIC stands for Free, Prior, and Informed Consent. It's a key principle in international human rights law established by International Labor Organization's Convention 169 and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It protects Indigenous peoples' livelihoods and territories and ensures that these communities have the right to give or withhold their consent to projects or activities that may affect their lands, territories, resources, or cultural heritage. And it's based in this broader right to self-determination. It has become a legal requirement in many countries and is increasingly a requirement for participation in many sustainability standards and a prerequisite for funding from international finance institutions as well. Once again, thank you so much, Daniel, for being here today. It's always a pleasure speaking with you and hearing your unique perspectives.
Good morning, Kaki. Thanks for inviting me to speak this morning.
Wonderful. So I think it's no secret that Indigenous lands have been really important in U.S. energy discussions for many years, and they're increasingly being centered in discussions around U.S. energy independence and critical materials needed for the energy transition. And I'm not sure how many listeners realize this, but I wanted to share some data points just to frame our discussion a little bit. Globally, more than half of mineral deposits needed for the global energy transition, including lithium and cobalt, copper and nickel, things for batteries and solar panels, are found near or on Indigenous lands. In the U.S., tribal lands account for more than 6% of the U.S.'s renewable energy potential, according to NREL. So I think given, this great overlap of resources and clean energy potential on tribal lands, I wanted to just set the scene with your perspective on this type of development and how Indigenous sovereignty should be centered in this discussion in the U.S. So Daniel, what does FPIC mean to your community, not just as a legal principle, but as a lived practice?
If we step back a little bit, right, we know that here in the U.S., FPIC, this idea comes from, as you mentioned, UNDRIP, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Our country hasn't ratified that treaty. Most countries have. The vast majority, I think, there's very few that haven't. We're one of them, and even though it's not legally binding, I think it's more of a vision statement on how we should be. And so I look at FPIC, and FPIC's one component of UNDRIP, but I look at FPIC as sort of a guiding principle for how I operate my business, how I view development. Here in the U.S., there's 574 federally recognized tribes, separate sovereign nations within a nation, and then compounded. If you look at our population, 1/3 of our people collectively live on a reservation on Indian lands. 2/3 of our people live in urban and suburban areas off reservation. Where they're just one of many groups. And so FPIC's important because it boils down for me and for many in our communities to inform consent. There's the free and the prior part, which isn't a given, but to me the most important part is that we're informed, that our communities have information. We have as much information as possible. Our leaders and our community leaders have that information then to make a decision. That's where the consent comes in. And there's a legal term, I guess, to consent. But I see consent sort of as a process of trying to understand and educate ourselves about a specific project, technology, whether it's a mine or an oil and gas well, a highway, a pipeline. It really is about working with communities, developers working with communities, governments working with our communities when they want to see a project that developed. That's important, right? And as you mentioned, energy security and America First, these policies which have really always been there, but primarily in the last decade, over the first Trump administration and now the second Trump administration, we've really been focused on those. And as you mentioned, as we transition into a new economy, a digital economy, around AI and data centers, as we transition into newer, more efficient technologies, more efficient use of fossil energy as well as of renewable energies. The building blocks of that transition here in the U.S. and around the world goes through Indigenous lands and Indian country here. So, as you mentioned, 50% of these minerals lie on Indigenous lands. Here in the U.S., those four minerals, copper, nickel, lithium, and cobalt, over 67% and higher lie within Indian country, or within 30 miles of a reservation. And so that means that the energy transition has to go through Indian country. This is a fact. It's something that we can't get around. We can't deny. If we're going to be leading as a country in critical minerals, we have to work with Indian country because those resources lie on our lands. And which means that, even more important than the fossil energy revolution and the primary industrialization, the next wave of industrialization in our country around AI, it does go through Indian country. And so that means that we have to be at the same table. We have to have the same information to be able to make those decisions right along with our neighbors.
Yeah, I mean, those are such good points. I think you're really, hit the nail on the head. Like, this is something, it's kind of an unavoidable conversation. And I think that's why it's so important to kind of have these conversations about how to do it correctly, I guess, for lack of a better term, and really, what the stakes are, I think, for the U.S. economy as well as tribes in the U.S. So The next question is about just the U.S. context. And I know you mentioned the U.S. hasn't adopted, UNDRIP hasn't adopted ILO 169. So what does tribal sovereignty, how does it intersect with state and federal permitting processes for large-scale energy and resource extraction projects? I know you have kind of firsthand experience with this in many ways as a business owner and in a lot of your roles. So I'd be interested to hear kind of what that intersection looks like from your perspective.
Well, no, thanks. That's a great question. Honestly, when our modern Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and the permitting around those laws were created, tribes weren't really thought about. Although we're governments, we were sort of added after the fact. And so those were primarily written with the states and localities and feds in mind. That's really where the mindset has been to this day. They weren't, the laws weren't built to cater to our needs, right? And so under those laws, we were treated more as a interest group, which rubs some tribal leaders, a lot of tribal leaders, the wrong way, right? You'll hear a term, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it's really the perspective is that we're not interest groups, we're governments, and and as tribal law not only has evolved throughout time, and as our neighbors, as our state and federal leaders, and the bureaucracy, the folks that deal with the permits and move them through the process have begun to incorporate tribes into that. So it's difficult, right? It's like, I hate to use an analogy, but it's like trying to fix the plane when it's in the air, and that's basically what we've done around permitting. To me, that's an opportunity to make sure that tribes are at the table, but increasingly that's become difficult over time. I mean, with politics, with changing administrations at the federal level, changing administrations at all the state levels, some understand and work well with tribes, others don't understand, and it's more difficult to work with them, and that fluctuates up and down over time. And so constantly we're having to put out fire. It's like trying to put out a fire every day, as well as try to do your job and run a government and develop our community and our economies at the same time. Because we all, as tribal leaders, we all wear different hats, multiple hats, and sometimes at the same time. And so really, there are consultants and lawyers and advisors in this space that can provide guidance to governments, primarily state and federal governments and local governments. But, so that's really what we're tasked to do, is we're constantly trying to educate our neighbors on how to incorporate our needs into those permitting processes. And like I said, even though, as we're seeing with this administration, different interpretations of our laws. And so that makes it sometimes more difficult, especially when folks like me, tribes and tribal law and tribal history and are just part of what we do. Most people that we deal with, tribes are an afterthought, not purposefully. It's just something that in our education system and in our society, there's a lot, again, we see all kinds of things. We see a lot of pride, and we see a lot of support for our history and our cultures, but at the same time, we're dealing with voting rights and other things that are, it seems like we're being attacked. And so I just say that moving forward, the opportunity to guide and to educate our partners, our federal and our state partners and neighbors, is there, and that's what we look for. I look forward to doing, but it is a full-time job to do that, and it's something that most other groups don't have to do. But because we're governments and sovereign, and you mentioned self-determination, we're self-determined and sovereign governments. It just goes with the job.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think you raised some really critical points, and kind of bottom line here is that there's the infrastructure, the underlying infrastructure for this federal and even state level process is just not encompassing of rights holders and tribal governments and tribal perspectives, and even your right to determine your own kind of path of development. So I think, working within those confines. I mean, I've heard of examples where states, different project processes have actually gone well. Folks have gone above and beyond the kind of legal requirements. And so I'm curious if you have any examples in mind of kind of large scale energy projects or engagements with your tribe or any other U.S. tribe that went well, and what lessons learned we can kind of bring out from those.
I think the idea of going well is that's really up to individuals. I see some projects that didn't come to fruition. The process in my mind went well as could be. So one project that I worked on for almost a decade didn't come to fruition for various reasons. Not during the COVID, it didn't have anything to do with COVID or with its feasibility financially. It was more of a issue with the project developer and their financing. They had an investment, or they had investors that had a sunset of 10 years, and they were in the investment for 10 years, and so they had to remove themselves, and so the project bankrupted. But it wasn't because it was a bad idea. So there's a project that I worked on in the Northwest. Again, it didn't come to fruition. It was a coal port, an export facility in Washington State at Longview called the Millennium Bulk Terminal, and primarily the engagement. So I worked for the developer, representing the developer, engaging with 4 tribes, the Critfic tribes, the Columbia River Treaty tribes along the Columbia in the Northwest. And although they were against the project for all kinds of different reasons, it still meant that we can engage, we can have dialogue, we could let them know what we were doing, timelines. We're very transparent with our information. From my perspective as a former tribal leader, which I served for my tribe for many years in California, information is key. And that's why I mentioned previously, to me, the informed consent is the most important. And so in my job at that time, I really pushed the idea of providing as much information as we could, making sure that the tribe had the opportunity to try to understand. If they choose not to take the information, if they were set in their ways and their opinions, that's out of my control. So that's why I think ultimately, even though the project didn't come to fruition, I believe it's an example of a good process, because I really made a conscious effort, and the folks, the developers, did as well. They bought into the idea as well. They put a lot of resources into that engagement, and so I'd say that was from my perspective and from the perspective of informed consent, I'd say that was a successful project. There are many projects that actually do come to fruition where it didn't go as planned or it didn't go right, and so again, it's a subjective, I guess, definition. But that's what I strongly believe to this day is that the more information that we have as tribal leaders, as community leaders, as just community members, the better off we are, because then there's no excuse to not inform ourselves about whether it's a project or technology. But if we don't know anything, and then we're always kept in the dark, that's not good. And so that's why, to me, information is key.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a great example of, which perspective you're talking about. And again, informed that I and FPIC is so key. I'm curious from your point of view, the prior, and you mentioned timelines. So we get this question at Equitable Origin all the time, how early is early enough for prior? And then, we see a lot, these companies, these projects, even their funders, like you mentioned, have strict or set inflexible timelines. So how do you see, working with companies that have these strict timelines? Like, is it okay if an agreement isn't reached and the project doesn't go forward? Or are there better ways of working where, companies can build in more flexibility and kind of more ability to be dynamic when we're working with tribes?
No, you're right, Kathy. That's key. The flexibility, right? Most tribes, you don't operate by a specific timeline. It takes sometimes as long as it takes, and obviously, as you mentioned, for business, that's not how business operates. Is we operate on a more framed timeline, by quarter, by month, by week, sometimes even by day. Some of these projects are mapped out, but developers have to understand that we also give ourselves, as developers, we budget in. On the financial side, we budget in contingencies, right? Usually 10 or 15% for overruns and unforeseen things that make costs go up. And we should be doing the same thing on the time line as well, as if time were a budget. In a lot of ways, it is. And so I think it works both ways. Tribes have to evolve in terms of how we look at dealing with these projects. A lot of times, we're very collectively, sometimes we're very immovable. Like we don't want to be, we have our set ways and instead of tribes also being flexible, we're inflexible. And so it's a two-way street. If the expectation is that we expect developers and others to be flexible to meet our needs, we should also be flexible to meet their needs as well, and move forward like that. So you're right. The prior part is important as well. And I always say to developers, talk to the tribes as early as you can, even if it's even if it's still an idea, prior to developing a permit, prior to making an application. If you can, just go see the tribes, talk to them, brainstorm with them, even if it's at that level, right? As early as you can, I would suggest communicating with a tribe. And then on the flip side, right, a lot of folks, our government as well, look at consultation, consent, engagement as a process that you do only during the permit process side. Right. And then once we have a permit, once we're starting to construct, once we're operating, and then once we remediate, a lot of developers and operators don't engage with these communities because legally, it only applies to the beginning of the process. So I always say engagement happens throughout the life of a project, from when it's first thought of and developed all the way to when it's closed down and cleaned up. We're engaging constantly, and that could be decades. That could be 4 or 5 decades or longer. And so, but we're not thinking that way, right? We're not set up for that. Most companies are not, and only do the minimum of what they're legally responsible to do. So we have to move beyond that, right? And I think one of the opportunities around FPIC is that a big chunk of the companies that are in this space, whether they're an energy company, whether they're in the mining industry, they operate around the world. So they're most likely are already operating in jurisdictions in countries that have ratified UNDRIP and have requirements. And so if those companies can operate in those environments and still make money, there's no excuse not to do the same in our country, even though we haven't legally ratified that treaty and all the associated agreements. I think that they're in a conundrum, right? They're in most of the world they operate similar, and then they have to have the way they operate here in the U.S. is different, and compared to even Canada, and so it does make the cost of business go up. And so I'd say if we, like I said, using UNDRIP as a mission, a goal, companies should look at UNDRIP as a goal. And if they're not there yet, to me, it's just the cost of doing business. It's the cost of doing business right, but it's also an investment. So instead of looking at these costs, the engagement, the free, prior, and informed consent, rather than looking at it as just a bottom line cost that we have to try to control. We should look at it on the other side of our business statement, financial statement. We should look at that engagement as an investment. And so, which will bring us dividends throughout the life of the investment, rather than a cost that we need to control.
Yeah, I love the explanation you gave about budgeting for overruns in your financial budget, but also in your thinking about it in your timeline and being flexible. And yeah, I mean, just great point. So touching kind of on the transactional nature and sort of how in the US folks are limiting FPIC and consultations to the permitting phase, I'm just curious, and you touched on it a little bit already, but what's your vision for how companies and tribes create these genuine partnerships that last, from pre-project all the way through closure and kind of stretch beyond this transactional nature? I think you mentioned, incorporating UNDRIP, but I think there's a pretty big visioning, or I guess like a pretty big change in approach that needs to happen, it sounds like, between companies.
No, for sure. And I'll as you know, you work with it every day, but I'll just put a plug in for Equitable Origin in our EO 100 standard. And why I mention it is because it's voluntary. So there's no mandates from government when it comes to what companies want to do and can do. I'd say that although we haven't ratified UNDRIP and most companies don't incorporate FPIC into their goals or their missions, some do. And they have shown, just like they've shown with the EO 100 standard, that it's the right thing to do and it doesn't impact the cost of doing business. I think that's one of the main factors of why companies don't incorporate more engagement, is because they think that it could be ruinous, or it could make their project or their what they're trying to sell, their product or service, too expensive. But there are plenty of examples from Equitable Origin of the companies that we deal with that are paying that cost and finding that it is not it's not a huge impact to their bottom line. Actually, it's almost negligible. And so, to me, like I said, this is what I advise companies that, and it's a long process. But again, a lot of these companies, as I mentioned, they're already dealing with their foreign arms, whether it's Canada or Latin and Central America, Europe, where a lot of these standards and these ideas are in a legal framework where they have to do certain things. They're already doing them. And so I think that those are going to be the first movers, and are already the first movers. Companies like Exxon, companies like Rio Tinto and on the mining side, TransCanada, TC Energy, which is TC Energy now, and Enbridge, who are Canadian. They have this experience. And to me, I look to them, especially Enbridge. Enbridge has a really good Indigenous peoples plan that they've incorporated into their business, into their mindset, and the way that they think. And so, it is doable. And like I said, because these companies, operate across borders, I think that's the opportunity is to look at them as leaders in this space, but also encourage them, because there are some that do operate in Canada and don't really do much here in the US in terms of engagement, and they know better. And so I think it's really, really basically explaining and really emphasizing that this should be a voluntary process, that we shouldn't have mandates from government, even though, it would be nice if our government adopted UNDRIP, ratified it. To me, things work best in business when it's voluntary. But I think once we get a certain number of companies doing the right thing, then it becomes a regular part of doing business. And those companies that don't do the right thing will either have to or won't be in business in the future. And so I think that's how we make the change that's needed.
Yeah, those are some great examples. And I definitely think, EO's in the business of creating kind of a higher bar and creating these voluntary frameworks that companies can adopt and sign on to. And I think it's a it's a great kind of bridge. And just to, I guess, give a plug too to our FPIC 360 tool, which is sort of another framework for multi-party engagement around free, prior, and informed consent. I think there are tools out there, and there are companies already doing the right thing, and it's kind of like them doing more, but also latching on to some of the best practice frameworks that can really demonstrate, comprehensive kind of approaches to these kind of sticky issues, and demonstrating that this is an investment in people, this is an investment in opportunities and resources, and not a liability, as many, I think, companies in the US kind of feel that it is. So in terms of, solutions and a vision, what changes in policy or funding or capacity building do you think would most strengthen FPIC implementation in the US at the moment? I know you mentioned, there are frameworks out there. People are already doing the right thing. They just need to bring them to the US and all these voluntary frameworks. But is there anything else that you think could really move the needle?
I think for sure, right? So on the tribal side, I think that one of the things that limits engagement obviously is the lack of resources. I mean, there are 574 tribes, and a lot of people look at gaming, which can be very lucrative for some tribes. So, but if 10% of our tribes, even if we do 25%, I know it's not that high, but if we say 25% of those tribes, over 100 of those tribes are very wealthy from gaming. That still leaves over 450 tribes that are not. So lack of resources is really an impediment to engaging, because engagement's a two-way street, right? Companies can come to tribes, governments can come to tribes with all the information in the world. If they followed my advice and just like dumped information in Indian country, it's like trying to drink through a fire hose. We would be inundated with information. And so Indian country right now doesn't have the capacity collectively to take that information, disseminate it, and then look at it and sit down and try to understand it. We don't have a lot of engineers. We don't have a lot of advisors on staff that are just waiting for this information to cross their desk. And so I'd say that tribes have talked about this, but I think that we have to get a little bit more serious about budgeting. And if it's that important to us, because it is, we need to educate ourselves. We need to create that internal infrastructure in order to take that information, collate it, and understand it, and then in a way that our people and our leaders can understand. And so I think that takes resources, whether that's money that are in our internal government resources that we have, or new resources that we need to raise, or if that's maybe a foundation of a partnership with the private sector. Maybe that's something that the private sector can pitch in with some resources to be able to strengthen the tribes, our capacity to inform ourselves. I think that's really lacking on the tribal side, but on the private sector side, I think that's also an opportunity. As I mentioned, we need to look at engagement as an investment rather than a cost. And if more companies did that, I think that they're going to reap those benefits. And those companies that do that do reap those benefits. They do have their projects. If they do engagement well, for the most part, their projects are successful. They can keep their costs down, but then they can create a project that not just makes them money, but also provides jobs in those communities. And so really, if we do things right and for the right reason, I think those companies can pitch in to help their neighbors, the tribes that they're impacting by their projects. I think that we can move forward in that way. And then one last thing on the policy side, I think that as we've seen over the last year or two with the Chevron case, with our NEPA, we've seen that over the years NEPA has expanded beyond its original scope. And the Supreme Court here in the U.S. has sort of pushed back and said, we need to look at what the original intent of the Congress when they passed NEPA. And so, we haven't really seen many projects, the major projects happen yet. And so we're waiting to see if the Chevron deference is going to be enforced. at the NEPA, at the permitting level. But that's something that tribes also have to prepare ourselves for, because we were so focused on looking at a more global impacts. That this is where greenhouse gases and other things come into play on a local project. We've got to go back. We're going back to looking at the local impacts only. And so back to the project, the Millennium Bulk Terminal that I mentioned earlier, is that there was a lot of pushback with the permits that they had applied through the state of Washington. And if that project were alive today, most likely it would have, under this administration, it would have been approved and probably into construction by now. They would have applied NEPA in the proper way. But again, so it's a long-term process, right? Hopefully I always like to say, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And so this is a time where some people view tribes and the opportunities moving forward as lemons. They don't really see they're not really optimistic. But I see optimism. I see opportunity, and we really have to make lemonade. So that's why we need to educate ourselves, build our capacity internally, and work with our partners, our private sector and federal and state partners, to help.
So you mentioned the EO100 standard as a tool for engagement, but I know Equitable Origin also has an FPIC tool called FPIC 360. What's the role of tools like this in kind of bringing folks together around concepts like FPIC?
I'm glad you mentioned that, Kaki, because FPIC 360, I think, is a really great tool for transparency purposes. It's not 100% complete. It was developed. A lot of the work was done during COVID, and some of the funding dried up. So we didn't. Equitable Origin didn't complete it, but it can still be used. The tool can still be used as a template and a guide for engagement. Obviously, we're talking about Indigenous communities, and so that's really the foundation of it. And how companies, organizations, it's really, anybody could use it. It's really a tool that can be used to guide engagement in all its different facets and aspects. But I'd say if you're listening and you haven't heard about it before and you want to take a look at our website, Equitable Origin's website, and download the tool. It's pliable enough so that you can use that for your community. If you're not living or part of an Indigenous community, or if you're in other kind of communities in our country and around the world, I think the foundational tools that are part of it can apply to your project or to your organization. And so I'd say, please take a look at that. I think it's really important. We don't really talk about it a lot, but I think it's an area where it's one of my goals, being a board member of Equitable Origin, to finish the development of the tool, to make it more of a tool that the newer generations can understand. So hopefully we can create an app around it. But that's just my dream. But it's something that it's really important to Equitable Origin, and that's something that I think that collectively we want to do, and it's really important to the work that we do. So
thank you so much. If you'd like to learn more about Equitable Origin, please visit our website, equitableorigin.org, where you can access the EO100 standard and the FPIC 360 tool. I guess in closing, are there any stories or lessons from your community that you would like listeners to remember after this conversation as a sort of takeaway?
I'd just say, not so much a lesson or a story, but just to remind everybody that Indigenous peoples, not just in this country but around the world, all people, right? If we go back far enough, everybody came from a tribe of some sort, from tribal societies, and the reason I mention that is to remind everybody that we were very adaptive. Prior to contact, we could adapt. We adapted to the environment. We adapted to the weather. We adapted to natural disasters. Very not. I don't want to say easy, but if we didn't, we wouldn't be here today. And so, really, that to remind everybody on both sides if we think about how we can adapt, how we can change, that means we change our attitudes, we change our opinions, we change the way we do things, because we have to. If we want our children, we want our communities, we want our neighborhoods to succeed. And that's really what it's all about, is that, tribes want to prosper and be self-determined, right? Make our own decisions. And like I said, FPIC is just one facet of that, one opportunity to do that. And so I'd say to both sides is to remind ourselves, sometimes we have to stop and remind ourselves that we can do it, that we've done it in the past, and that nothing is insurmountable. And so, but we have to be adaptive. We have to change the way we do things. And if we're truly self-determined, or if our tribes are truly sovereign, that means sometimes we have to do things on our own. And it's scary and it's hard and it can be expensive, but like I said, we just have to do it. And so like I said, educate ourselves. FPIC to me is a guide. Although even if it was passed, UNDRIP was passed, it really wouldn't be binding legally. So if we look at it as a template or as a guide to move forward and look at it over generations. I mean, it's hard to hear this sometimes, that we have to wait decades before actual change will happen. But each of us can help make that change. I believe that, right? If we incorporate the concepts and the ideas of UNDRIP and FPIC into our lives and how we do things, and then we inform our friends and our neighbors and our allies, even people who aren't friends. I think if it will sink in, eventually that change will happen in those goals and missions of each of those companies and of our governments will change. So I'd say I'll leave it with that. Is that I think that there's hope, and to remind everybody that to be adaptable.
Thank you so much, Daniel. This was a super inspiring conversation and really helpful. I think it's pretty clear from our discussion today the importance of adaptation in this moment. And I think you're right. We don't give ourselves credit for how kind of adaptable we can be and we should be, at this moment. So I think we've outlined some challenges, definitely, but also some solutions if we can kind of buckle down and work together and adapt to the moment. So thank you again so much for your time. Please get in touch if you have any questions about FPIC or other areas we've covered in today's podcast. You can also register for our upcoming webinar on this topic, where Daniel will be joining Equitable Origin board member Yadira Okagwe and other guest speakers, which is to be confirmed. So stay tuned. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kaki, and thank you, Daniel. That was a brilliant discussion. Thank you so much for joining us today. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in to this episode of Suits and Boots. Please check out the rest of the TDI Sustainability series of podcasts on our Suits and Boots podcast series. And hopefully see you all next time. Thanks.